the most insidious and deeply terrifying psychological virus intentionally spread by the modern system is the absolute pathetic illusion of the victim mentality. From the exact moment you enter this incredibly soft modern society, you are actively, systematically trained to aggressively seek sympathy instead of power. You are heavily programmed to look at every single massive failure, every incredibly brutal defeat, and every agonizing setback in your life, and immediately point your fragile finger at the external universe. You violently, aggressively blame the massive economic system. You deeply, passionately complain about your completely unfair genetics, and you desperately construct massive, elaborate fictional stories about how the entire world is deliberately, actively conspiring against your ultimate success. This is a massive, terrifying psychological suicide completely accepted by the weak. 99%. The absolute brutal reality that you must immediately, violently internalize. Absolutely. No one cares about your pathetic excuses. The system actively rewards your complaining because a massive population of professional victims is incredibly easy to completely, absolutely control. When you actively choose to constantly, heavily complain about your massive disadvantages, you are literally, voluntarily handing over the absolute terrifying keys of your massive internal citadel to the very people you despise. You are aggressively cementing yourself to the absolute bottom of the food chain while expecting the massive, chaotic universe to miraculously, suddenly pity you. The apex predator absolutely, completely, violently rejects this incredibly sickening disease. The Shadow Emperor completely understands that seeking external sympathy is the absolute ultimate display of pathetic biological weakness. Every single time you open your mouth to passionately complain about how incredibly difficult your massive journey as you are actively, violently draining the raw kinetic energy entirely required to actually aggressively fix the massive problem. You must completely, violently sever your pathetic addiction to being a victim. You must aggressively, entirely murder the weak, fragile version of yourself that constantly, desperately begs for a completely unfair world to suddenly treat you with gentle kindness. The world will absolutely never be kind. You must mutate into an absolute terrifying machine of cold, brutal execution. Stop passionately begging the storm to stop raining and violently, aggressively build the massive iron roof yourself. The weak masses will constantly, passionately try to drag you down into their pathetic, massive puddle of endless tears. They absolutely despise the terrifying, completely independent architect because your absolute massive, unyielding strength violently exposes their completely voluntary, massive weakness. You must completely, violently crush their pathetic, massive expectations and absolutely dominate the massive present. To aggressively construct the massive architecture of the Shadow Empire, you must completely, violently shatter the absolute, massive, childish illusion of fairness. The weak, pathetic modern masses operate entirely on the deeply flawed psychological assumption that the universe absolutely owes them an incredibly balanced, massive level playing field. They look at the apex predators who have violently, aggressively conquered massive territories, and they bitterly, passionately scream that the massive game is entirely rigged. They are completely, absolutely correct. The massive, chaotic game of reality is entirely, absolutely, violently rigged, and it has been fundamentally rigged since the absolute dawn of human civilization. The absolute, terrifying, massive truth is that fairness is a completely fake, synthetic concept entirely invented by incredibly weak people to actively, desperately protect themselves from the brutal, massive reality of absolute raw power. The massive lion absolutely never violently apologizes to the incredibly weak gazelle for possessing massive, superior physical strength. The Shadow Emperor completely, heavily accepts the absolute, terrifying unfairness of the universe and actively, aggressively weaponizes it. You must deeply, completely, absolutely Understand that you will absolutely never be given a massive equal starting line. You will be completely, violently thrown into massive situations where you are entirely heavily outmatched, entirely, massively underfunded, and completely, absolutely surrounded by massive, terrifying enemies. This is not a pathetic excuse to completely surrender. This is the absolute, terrifying, exact, massive environment where your massive iron will is fundamentally, brutally forged. When you completely, aggressively, permanently abandon the pathetic, childish expectation that the massive world should be entirely fair, you suddenly, absolutely unlock a completely terrifying reservoir of massive, aggressive psychological freedom. You absolutely stop wasting your incredibly valuable, massive time passionately debating the massive rules of the system, and you, violently, aggressively, begin executing completely outside of them. The absolute 1% completely, violently exploit the massive unfairness of the massive chaos. They entirely, aggressively thrive precisely because the weak, massive crowd is entirely, completely paralyzed by their own pathetic, massive indignation. You must completely, aggressively stop waiting for the massive, corrupt referees of society to suddenly validate your massive struggle. The absolute, only massive, universal law that completely, truly exists is the absolute violent execution of brutal, massive, undeniable results. Destroy the pathetic, massive illusion. Embrace the absolute, massive, chaotic unfairness. The massive system is completely designed to utterly crush the hopelessly naive. You must violently, permanently carve your absolute, massive justice into the incredibly cold, unyielding stone of reality. The absolute, ultimate, terrifying, psychological override completely required to rule the massive shadow empire is the violent, massive adoption of extreme, absolute ownership. You must immediately, actively, systematically program your fragile mind to completely, aggressively take absolute, complete blame for absolutely every single massive occurrence in your entire reality. This is an incredibly massive, heavy psychological burden that absolutely crushes the weak, pathetic modern mind. If your massive strategic business completely, violently collapses because of a massive, unpredictable, external, global crisis, it is absolutely entirely your massive fault for completely failing to aggressively, strategically build a massive, indestructible contingency plan. If your absolutely closest allies violently, completely betray you in that absolute dark, it is absolutely entirely your massive fault for completely failing to accurately, aggressively assess their deeply pathetic, weak human nature. You must violently, aggressively, entirely stop pointing the massive, pathetic finger at completely external variables. When you actively, violently blame the massive external world for your absolutely brutal, massive failures, you are completely, entirely declaring yourself a completely powerless, pathetic, absolute passenger in your own massive life. The Shadow Emperor is absolutely, entirely, completely the massive, terrifying dictator of his absolute reality. When you violently, aggressively assume completely 100% massive responsibility for your absolutely darkest, massive failures, you simultaneously, completely, absolutely, violently claim entirely 100% massive total control over your absolute future trajectory. There is absolutely massive, terrifying, ultimate power in looking directly into the absolute black, massive abyss of your completely devastating failure and saying absolutely coldly, I completely, entirely allowed this massive destruction to happen, and I will absolutely, violently, completely ensure it absolutely never happens again. You must completely, systematically, entirely strip away all of your massive, deeply comfortable safety nets. You are absolutely, completely, massively alone in the absolute freezing, dark void, and absolutely no one is miraculously, heavily coming to aggressively save you. The massive absolute cavalry is absolutely, entirely, completely dead. You must violently, aggressively become the absolute, massive, terrifying force that completely, actively rescues yourself. Take the massive, heavy, crushing, absolute blame. Carry the massive, completely heavy, rusted iron cross. When you aggressively stop pointing the massive, fragile finger at the external universe, you instantly, violently unlock the absolute highest tier of psychological dominion. There is absolutely zero massive room for pathetic excuses inside the impenetrable walls of the true Shadow Empire. You absolutely, entirely, completely own the massive consequences when you have completely, successfully, aggressively murdered the massive, pathetic victim mentality and absolutely, entirely assumed extreme, massive ownership. You arrive at the ultimate massive execution, weaponizing the massive trauma. The incredibly weak, massive masses completely allow their deep, heavy emotional trauma, their completely violent betrayals, and their absolutely massive, devastating failures to completely define them as absolute, pathetic, broken victims. They actively, passionately carry their incredibly heavy wounds as massive, pathetic badges of honor to completely, constantly, desperately extract cheap, massive sympathy from the weak, massive herd. The apex predator completely, aggressively, entirely flips this massive biological equation. You must completely, violently, aggressively view your absolutely darkest, massive, painful experiences as incredibly highly refined, entirely volatile, massive rocket fuel. Every single absolute massive time the chaotic world completely, violently, unfairly struck you down, it was absolutely, entirely depositing a massive, heavy, terrifying reservoir of kinetic, dark energy directly into your massive internal citadel. You must absolutely, aggressively, systematically channel every single massive ounce of that incredibly deep, heavy, dark rage directly into your massive, brutal execution when you are completely, violently, entirely exhausted and your massive physical biology is actively, passionately screaming for comfortable, absolute rest. You must violently, aggressively remember the absolute, exact, massive faces of the incredibly pathetic, weak people who actively, passionately doubted you. You must completely, absolutely, intensely remember the incredibly cold, massive, freezing sting of every absolutely brutal, unfair, massive defeat. Yeah, absolutely. Do not completely, passionately forgive, and you absolutely, entirely never completely, massively forget. You completely, aggressively, violently transmute the massive, heavy, completely devastating pain into absolute, terrifying, massive, undeniable physical success. The massive Shadow Empire is not completely safely built on a massive, soft foundation of completely happy, massive, positive, comfortable thoughts. It is completely, violently, aggressively forged in the absolute, massive, terrifying, dark fires of completely overcome trauma and completely, aggressively weaponized, massive, absolute pain. You are entirely, absolutely not a massive, fragile, pathetic victim of your incredibly dark, completely chaotic past. You are the completely, absolute, massive, terrifying, aggressive architect of its absolute, total destruction. You must completely, violently, aggressively rise from the absolute, massive, crushing ashes of your own completely dead, pathetic excuses. Weaponize the absolute, massive, heavy, dark void. Execute or completely, entirely die. Your absolute, massive, terrifying, undeniable execution is the only true revenge. Let the massive, weak crowd violently burn in their pathetic, massive regret.